Right, let's go now to the big breaking news this afternoon. The Victorian Health Department has been charged with 58 breaches of the Occupational Health and Safety Act over the Andrews government hotel quarantine program, which led to more than 800 deaths last year in Victoria. The charges laid by Victoria's workplace safety watchdog relate to the period between March and July last year, which was the initial phase of the hotel quarantine program. Each of which, these charges, have a fine of $1.6 million, up to $1.6 million. Victorian Opposition Leader Matthew Guy joins me now and he'll weigh in. Matthew Guy, I think we've got to make the point up front. These are charges, aren't they, against the Health Department, not ministers or senior officials. Is this likely to end up a slap on the wrist and a heavy bill for the taxpayer, but nobody really responsible? If that's the case, what sort of justice is that to the families of the 800 dead?
Peter, it's a farce, a complete farce. What we have is a government statutory authority charging a government department for ministers' decisions, and the taxpayer will pay the fine. And when we talk about this, as you said, we've got to remember 800 Victorians died during hotel quarantine, the debacle that was quarantined down here in Victoria last year. That's more Victorians than died during Black Saturday, more people than died during our entire commitment to the Vietnam War. I mean, that puts it into perspective about the extent of the disaster that was hotel quarantine here in Victoria. It appears that fines which will be paid by the taxpayer for WorkCover suing the Department of Health is almost farcical. It's farcical for the families who lost loved ones. For Victorians who want better, should we have to rely on a hotel quarantine system again? And frankly, for the ministers who all claim, including the Premier, that they can't remember who signed off on the arrangements to put this in place, how on earth can we have any level of confidence that this won't happen again?
You've worked for senior ministers, you've been a senior minister yourself. It's not the Department of Health that makes decisions. Individuals make decisions, senior bureaucrats make decisions, ministers make decisions. How likely are we to see justice? I mean, will we see the Premier, for example, in the witness box under very different evidence rules than we saw in the circus that was the Code Inquiry last year? Will we see Minister Makakos in the witness box? Are we going to get answers here? And how can we get answers?
Peter, the Andrews government in February 2020 passed laws around deaths in workplaces. They passed these laws. It's their laws. The first people up are them. And it appears there's two rules, one for private business and one for them. Their memories are all defunct. They can't remember. So no justice for anyone involved in the state government stuffing up and killing 800 people. But if it was a private business, can you imagine? If it was a Liberal government, can you imagine the outrage from the left, the outrage from the Labor Party, the outrage from people who are fellow travellers of this current government in Victoria? And rightly so, I might add, because 800 Victorians have died. And what it appears is there'll be no justice for those people, for their families, frankly, for the rest of the state who has watched this circus from afar and now seen that when charges are laid, they're laid against a department, not against an individual. The buck stops with the Premier, the buck stops with his ministers, and they are the people who should be facing justice, not the Department of Health.
I mean, it wasn't that long ago that Barry O'Farrell resigned over failing to disclose a bottle of wine. He lost his job as Premier over a bottle of wine. We had Bronwyn Bishop lose her job as Speaker of the House of Representatives over legitimate expenditure, $3,000 for a helicopter that didn't pass the pub test, even though it was inside the rules. How does this go on in Victoria when no other jurisdiction would cop this level of incompetence?
I've said this on yours and other programs before. There is no accountability left in the state of Victoria. The state of Victoria and the governance of this state has become a farce, as evidenced by the WorkCover authority suing the department over decisions made by a minister, and they'll all get off scot-free. It is a complete farce to even suggest that, let alone realise that that's what's occurring today. There's no justice in Victoria. The system in Victoria the system of governance is completely broken. The Parliament is shut down by a mid-level health bureaucrat, and yet the cheer squad for the current government in Victoria go on with reckless abandon that they hope this happens again. that they hope the government uses its powers to keep us locked up. We're the most locked up city in the world with no justice for people who died from hotel quarantine or their families. And I just find it stunning, and I can't say this enough, I find this decision today a complete and utter farce.
Should the Premier resign?
The Premier should have resigned a long time ago. His ministers, a number of involved, should have resigned a long time ago. They should have been honest with Victorians as to who was responsible for hotel quarantine. And I say it again, Peter, if this government won't call a royal commission into that debacle, then I will, and a Liberal Nationals government will. And we'll do that because Victorians deserve it. We had royal commissions into disasters that were Black Saturday, rightly so, called by the Brumby government, rightly so. And how could we not have a royal commission into a disaster that has tragically taken 2.5 times the number of lives as Black Saturday? But we don't have that in Victoria, and instead we have those responsible for the debacle getting off scot-free.
The other big news today too is the Victorian health system. The predicted cases in Victoria, we're told, could get up as high as 3,000 today, confirmed by the government. But there's already ambulance ramping around the metropolitan hospitals. 000 calls are going through the roof, and great concern over the capacity of the hospitals to look after those that with the pandemic could be in need of ICU beds. Of course, they were promised to receive 4,000 ICU beds last year, but they haven't materialised either, have they?
Well, Peter, Victorians have every right to ask, why is our hospital system not ready? Every government in Australia has seen what's coming, and that is opening up. We've seen it for 18 months now. Every government has known, state, federal, Labor, Liberal, we've known we have to be ready for this moment. And in Victoria, we're not ready for this moment, despite the government promising 4,000 new ICU beds, intensive care beds, in April last year. Fair enough, it was a good announcement. The problem is that those beds have not materialised. The money's been spent, $1.3 billion, but the beds haven't materialised. A few dozen have materialised. Victorians have every right to ask, how can this be the case? We know that we're going to reopen. We know the problems with the system. We know there'll be pressures on intensive care units because of COVID. We understand all of that. So therefore, there's been this belief that the government will get us ready for the moment when we need to open up. That's straightforward common sense. Now we find 18 months later, we are not ready. Not only are we not ready for when we open up, we're not even ready now. There is hospital ramping occurring across Melbourne right now. Again, I ask, how can this be? The Premier has been Premier for 7 years. He was Health Minister before that for 4 years. For 11 of the last 15 years, he has been in charge of the health system in the state of Victoria. And it is fundamentally underprepared for the disaster that could come to Victoria because our system isn't up to scratch. New South Wales is, other states are. Why is not Victoria? That's a legitimate question to ask.
I've got to leave it there. Matthew Guy, thank you for your time.
Thanks again, Peter.